Okay, welcome to the Office of Undergraduate Research Education Series. Today's session is on the Introduction to the Institutional Review Board, or the IRB, and today's speaker is Gary Henderson. This is a virtual event and it is being recorded, so we ask everyone to mute yourself and turn off your camera to ensure the best experience. And if you have questions, please put them in the chat feature, or you can unmute when invited by the speaker. And this is the event evaluation QR code. We would appreciate everybody completing this after this presentation, but the SPUR and Europe scholars must complete the evaluation in order to receive credit for attending the event. And the mission for the University of Utah Office of Undergraduate Research is to facilitate and promote undergraduate student-faculty collaborative research and creative works in all disciplines throughout the University of Utah campus. And we would like to acknowledge that this land, which is named for the Ute tribe, is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. The University of Utah recognizes and respects the enduring relationship that exists between many indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. We respect the sovereign relationship between tribes, states, and the federal government, and we affirm the University of Utah's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities through education, research, and community outreach activities. And today's speaker is Gary Henderson. He's the operations manager for the IRB. I'll turn it over to Gary.
All right. Thank you, Shelley. I'm going to switch over the slide deck here. Thanks, everybody, for joining. Let me pull up these slides. While I pull up these slides, I figured I'd tell you a little bit about myself, because I always thought it was helpful when I was an undergrad to hear about other people's kind of trajectory. I'm a staff, an operations manager, as Shelley said, at the Institutional Review Board here at the University of Utah. I started working at the U of U after I got an undergraduate degree in sociology and a minor in philosophy, and I worked as an administrative assistant in the pediatrics department. Kind of got my foot in the door there. And while I worked there, I ended up going back to school to get a master's in public administration, after which I started working at the IRB maybe 8 years ago or so. And so that's all to show, although, I kind of had an academic path for a while there, I ended up just working at the University of Utah rather than going kind of the academic route in my career. So anyway, my goal here today is to talk to you about the Institutional Review Board. I'll always refer to it as an IRB. This is an introductory, so I'll go over a lot of information. You're not expected to remember it all. It's kind of, hopefully you get away with this, a few things. So here are my objectives here. I want to review first the foundation of human subject research protection. So we'll kind of look at like a snippet of the historical reasons why we have human subject research protections, which is what IRBs do, and we'll talk about that. And then I would hope to understand your IRB, and by your IRB, I mean the University of Utah IRB. I understand some of you might be affiliated with other schools. Most higher academic centers have their own IRBs. Most hospital systems have their own IRBs. But we'll talk about the University of Utah IRB, although it is very similar to other institutions if you have a different one. And how it applies to your research in the future. If you're doing anything now, or as students, you'll probably do research that has something to do with IRB in the future. So we'll talk about that. And then lastly, I'd love to just leave you with an idea of all the resources you have to support your research endeavors in the future when it comes to IRB related research. And we'll talk about that, what that means. So with that in mind, with those objectives in mind, here's the outline. We'll do a historical foundation, then we'll talk about the IRB's mission and composition. We'll talk about what the IRB reviews and what the criteria is for approving research through an IRB. And then again, I'll tell you about the resources you have to help you in the future. So the historical foundation of human subjects protection. This can be a little depressing because there's some unethical history here. I'll just go over it fairly briefly. This slide here is supposed to represent kind of a timeline. As you can see, the top here, these are kind of, you know, some of them are codes, some of them are laws. They're different policies that were passed. And then the bottom illustrates some kind of landmark unethical research cases that kind of basically kind of made the world, or in different places here, create policies for protecting human subjects research because of these past experiences with unethical research. So we'll touch on them briefly. And really, I just want you to kind of think about the common threads between these types of studies and what protections need to be in place and what maybe was unethical about them. So the first one we'll talk about is the Tuskegee and Guatemalan syphilis studies. You may have heard of this. This is fairly famous. And it's because it was actually done by the U.S. Public Health Service. So this was back in 1932 is when it started. And really, they just wanted to figure out how to treat syphilis. We did not have treatment for syphilis at the time, so the U.S. Public Service wanted to do that. So they did a research study. The population was part of Black America's population, some with syphilis, some without syphilis. There were a lot of unethical issues that happened here. Mainly, they were told they were being treated for bad blood. It was not very clear exactly what the research study was about. There was no full informed consent. They were told that they'd be given free medical care, meals, burial insurance, because the lifespan for people with syphilis was not too long. And they told them that they would be in the study for about 6 months, and it went on for 40 years, went all the way to 1972. And after the funding died, they continued in the study without giving anybody treatment. So in 1947, we discovered penicillin was an effective treatment for syphilis, and that was not returned to these subjects. So as you can see, a lot of unethical issues in that study. And then we go to 1941 to 44, and we talk about the Nazi experiments. I think you can all assume that doing research in Nazi concentration camps was not an ethical one. They did all sorts of human subjects research. They did exposure to mustard gas just to see how humans could handle it. This picture here is a sad picture of someone being subject to hypothermia to see when cold sets in and how it affects the body. They did high altitude experiments where they would go to high altitude just to see if the body could handle being dropped at high altitudes. They infected people with malaria. I mean, this was egregious, unethical issues, I think probably justifying it based on it being prisoners. That was the population. So there was a lot of deaths, okay? So there's just literally killing people for research purposes, just egregious acts here. And this is when we start talking about human subjects protections in general. So the Nuremberg Code, 1947, so soon after these Nazi experiments, was really a product of the Nuremberg trials. So these doctors that did these experiments on Nazi prison camps were tried and convicted. And so out of this came a Nuremberg Code is what they call it. And this is really just a set of principles that make it permissible to do a medical experiment. So if you look at these 10 bullet pointed ones here, there's all these ideas of, okay, we need voluntary consent. We need to make sure the risks are not exceeding humanitarian importance, things like this. We started thinking about how to do ethical research with human subjects. Around that same time, 1948, the World Medical Association, so this is when kind of the medical world started also thinking about how do we do ethical medical studies. Here, I'll go back to that slide. Sorry, I skipped ahead. So this is just the World Medical Association, and this is more of just a declaration. And that is that as medical professionals, they decided you agree to several ethical and humanitarian goals. So it's really nothing really concrete or specific about protecting human subjects, but they're at least addressing it here to say, as medical professionals, we need to make sure that we're treating humans correctly, ethically. And then 1948, again, another one, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is United Nations General Assembly. They came up with 30 articles affirming fundamental individual rights to be universally protected. So this is when we start talking about human rights and the United Nations doing it. And it had a significant document because it was adopted in and influenced most national constitutions since that point. So another element leading to the rights of humans in research. But of course, we still have examples of unethical research that happened. The tea room trade study, this is the 1960s here in America, PhD dissertation student wanted to observe male homosexual behavior in public toilets. Unethical behavior is, as you'd imagine, they didn't get informed consent, just observed people, lied to them about why they were there. I remember hearing that they, would look at license plates, follow them home, and act like a social worker just to get even more data on people instead of telling them about it. So some maybe not as egregious as the Nazi experiments, but certainly a similar trend in unethical treatment of human subject research. Then in 1964, the Declaration of Helsinki, this is the World Medical Association, got a little more specific here and came out with this Declaration of Helsinki, is what they called it. So this is ethical principles regarding human experimentation in the medical community. So if that first medical association one was mainly just professionals declaring that to treat humans ethically, this is specific to human experimentation. So it started getting a little more specific. It's a cornerstone document in research ethics to this date, with a principle of respecting individual rights to make informed decisions regarding research participation. So a lot of when we talk about informed consent in research, which we'll go into a little bit, a Declaration of Helsinki was kind of the start of establishing that and what that looks like. But of course, in the 70s, we still had some unethical research. The San Antonio contraceptive study. This was a population of Hispanic women who were actually seeking contraceptives, were enrolled in a study, and it was a double-blind trial. So half the population was given a contraceptive, half was given a placebo. They weren't told who was who, and halfway through they switched them. So everybody on this study had a placebo and did not actually have contraceptives. And so no informed consent was given. This could be considered a vulnerable population, and women became pregnant when they didn't want to. So another example of unethical treatment. And lastly, we'll talk about the Willowbrook experiments. This was a school, I think NYU kind of ran this state school. They just really wanted to study hepatitis. A lot of these mentally disabled children at this Willowbrook school had hepatitis, and they kind of just assumed that everybody would get it, and so they intentionally gave it to everybody. It was really, really sad. It lacked informed consent, and I say lack because they talked about it happening, but they did not get parental permission for these children who were obviously vulnerable to coercion and getting hepatitis. So exposing these kids to risk without any potential benefit was an obvious ethical issue. And then lastly, 1979, the United States came out with the Belmont Report, and this is still the cornerstone document that sets out 3 ethical principles that guide IRBs to date. And so we'll talk about those. So overall, I just kind of want to point out a big picture. Unethical research happens everywhere, not as egregious as the Nazi experiments necessarily, but in our back door by our public service through the years. And, this might seem like a long time ago, but it's really not. This is very recent. By 1979, we finally have some real ethical principles that guide IRBs today. And this was, at the time, the National Commission for Protection of Human Subjects in Biomedical and Behavioral Research. Now it's called the Department of Health and Human Services. Okay, so switching gears a little bit, that gives you a slight historical background on why we need human subjects protections for research. So that's where IRBs come in, and this is our mission and composition. So first, we'll talk about these basic ethical principles. So this is what the Belmont Report came out with, which is pretty straightforward. I like how simple it is, at least in theory. So there's this idea of the ethical principle of respect for persons. This is where we acknowledge and protect people's autonomy. So the idea of informed consent, informing people fully and making them have their own decision to be in research comes from this ethical principle. Then there's this idea of beneficence. We want to maximize the benefit of research while reducing risks as much as possible. Justice, and that's this idea that those who are bearing the burden should receive the benefit of the research. Okay, so if we think back to some of those unethical cases, you'll see This idea of respecting people wasn't there. This idea of beneficence likely wasn't there in those situations. And then definitely justice. The populations that were involved in these research studies weren't necessarily the ones receiving the benefit, right? The Tuskegee trial is a prime example of that, in that we had treatment for syphilis and we did not go back and treat those people that were in the research study. So these three ethical principles are what the IRBs go off of now. But there is also a regulatory foundation for IRBs. So it's an ethical review body, but then we also are making sure all research is up to regulatory quality. And that the main regulation is called the Common Rule, and that is the Department of Health and Human Services. This is what regulation document says the IRBs are to review and approve. But then there are other ones like the FDA. You're all familiar with the FDA. Here at the University of Utah, we have a medical campus. So the IRBs help make sure that any drug, food trials are subject to FDA regulations appropriately. There's HIPAA. I think you're all probably familiar with that. That's the protection of your medical record information. And then there's other oversight bodies that the University of Utah IRB deals with, like the VA hospital across the campus, where the IRB for research that happens there, Department of Defense and stuff like that. So the IRBs are largely just ethical bodies, but we also have a regulatory foundation as well. But our mission is laid out here. The number one thing our IRB is doing is protecting the rights and welfare of the human participants in research, okay? So we're thinking about the participants in research here and protecting their rights and welfare. But there's this other kind of secondary mission, is that we're overseeing compliance with these regulations, right? And so in a lot of ways, IRBs are here to protect investigators, study teams, and students like yourself doing research, and protecting the institution, just to make sure that we're doing research properly. Obviously, I wouldn't expect anybody to do egregious acts like our historical ones, but sometimes you don't really know as researchers what the regulations are, and that's our job as an IRB, is to help you make sure you're all in line with that. So that's the mission. We're mainly here protecting participants, and then secondary, we're protecting researchers in the institution as well. All right, so what type of research requires IRB oversight? This seems pretty simple in that if you're doing research, as illustrated by the yellow circle here, and you're dealing with human subjects in research, you want IRB review. That's where the IRB comes in. Obviously, there's a lot of research that doesn't involve humans. The IRBs don't review that. I know there's an ethical review body for animal research, and obviously laboratory research that doesn't deal with either doesn't necessarily need IRB review. But then when we break down the definitions that they have in the regulations of what a human participant is and what research is defined as, it gets a little more in the gray area. So I just wanted to lay it out here for you. The regulations say that a human subject in research is a living individual. So first they have to be alive, for whom the investigator is either collecting data through intervention or interaction. Okay, so that could be as small as a survey. You're interacting with them through a survey, or you're intervening them for a large drug trial or something. It could be either of those, that type of thing. Or you're actually doing research on identifiable private information. So even if you're not going out and interacting with someone to do your research, if you're analyzing data that is considered identifiable to someone and private, then that would be considered a human subject. So we see that a lot nowadays with so much data. If you're analyzing data that's considered private and identifiable, that's considered a human subject. And then the idea of research is defined like this. It says a systematic investigation, including research development, testing, and evaluation designed to develop and contribute to generalizable knowledge. So I think some of the key terms there is this idea of being systematic. That means, you actually have like a process for your research study where it's having a protocol, an idea that, okay, we did a literature review. Now we want to add to that type of research and generalize the knowledge from our research project. So if you have a human subject according to this definition, and if it's research according to this definition, the IRB has oversight and should approve the study before it occurs. So with that in mind, here's the types of research that probably, I say probably at the top because it's not necessarily based on the type of research you do, it's based on your overall objectives, but this is the type of research we see a lot. So surveys, interviews, focus groups, behavioral research, the IRB sees a whole lot because most of the time you're interacting with human subjects, right? Oral histories sometimes need IRB approval. We see a lot of retrospective chart review or medical record reviews, right? Or retrospective reviews of data that was already collected for some other reason. So we call that secondary data analysis. The data exists out there for some reason, and now you want to analyze it for a different research reason. Again, if that is private identifiable data, then the IRB reviews projects like that. Program evaluation, experimental educational initiatives. I highlighted in yellow the ones that most of the time students, type of projects students do. And so just give you a general idea, but at the University of Utah, there's so much research happening, and if it's a human subject and considered research, we review it. Okay, this slide shows you, it's a little outdated actually, but the IRB is a big operation. So we have, when I say institutional review board, there's actually a board, board members that are scientists, community members, and they meet once a week to review research applications. So we have over 100 IRB members that sit on these panels and review research applications. We have over 7,000 active studies at the University of Utah. I think this is quite a bit larger now. It's a big operation. Tons of research happens here. And then, like I said previously, the University of Utah IRB is actually the IRB of record for other places that are affiliated with the University of Utah, like Salt Lake City VA healthcare system, Primary Children's Hospital that is up there next to the University of Utah Hospital. We review research that happens there. And then the Shriners Hospital up in Salt Lake, we also review some research that happens there. So it's a big operation. I throw this slide in here because a lot of times people say, I need to get IRB approval, or I need to get my research study through the IRB process. And really what they mean is they need to go through the Human Research Protection Program, okay? So the IRB is one element that we're talking about now, but there are other elements of human research protections, like we have a HIPAA privacy office that deals with medical record information. We have a conflict of interest office that makes sure that anybody doing research doesn't have some sort of financial conflict that would alter the research or make it unethical in any way. We have ancillary reviews. If research happens at the VA or Primary Children's Hospital, or if research requires radiation, we have all these separate ancillary reviews. And then outside of the regulatory foundation that is federal, there's also state law and institutional requirements that we're required to meet. So you'll hear it a lot. Oh, I need to go through the IRB review process, but really a lot of it's the full Human Research Protection Program. You don't need to think about it a whole lot because the good thing at the University of Utah is our system is very centralized and it will navigate you through anything within the Human Research Protection Program that's required for your study, which for students, you usually don't need to deal with these other institutions. But just to keep that in mind, there's a whole Human Research Protection Program, not just an IRB. Okay, I threw this slide in here just because I think it's been helpful for students in the past to understand that institutional review boards are institutional specific, okay? So at the University of Utah, if you as a student, or if you end up being staff or faculty, if you want to do research study, the University of Utah IRB is your institutional review board because you're affiliated with the University of Utah. You might collaborate on a study with someone that works or is affiliated with another institution, say another student at BYU or UVU or USU. They have their own institutional review board, and they're subject to their institutional review board's approval, even if you're collaborating. Okay, so it's institutional specific. It's not based on where you recruit people. You might want to go to the farmer's market and do a survey study. The farmer's market's not going to have an IRB. It's just your University of Utah IRB would be it because you're acting on behalf of being a student there. Okay, so it's an institutional specific IRB. Okay, shifting gears a little bit. That's the mission and composition of the Institutional Review Board. Now we'll go into and look behind the scenes of what IRBs do, okay? So again, you don't need to remember this. This is just to give you an idea of what IRBs do. You, as a researcher, just submit applications to us, and this is what we do. So this is from the regulations. This is the criteria for approving research, okay? That's human subject research. As you probably notice on these are all tied kind of to some of those basic ethical principles. So IRBs are tasked with making sure the risks are minimized. The risk-benefit ratio is reasonable. We'll talk about these in a little more detail. Want to make sure that equitable selection of participants. Want to make sure informed consent is obtained as needed, and that consent is documented. Want to make sure data is monitored to ensure safety of participants, right? Even after you collect the data, there needs to be some monitoring to make sure that the privacy and confidentiality of participants is protected even after the data has been collected. And then if there's any vulnerable populations, that they are protected. We'll talk about that a little bit more detail. So assessing risk. So when the IRB assesses the risk of a research application or a research project or thought process, we're basically deciding two things. Is it minimal risk or is it greater than that? And that's literally it. There's two risk categories for every research study. And this is minimal risk is considered the probability and magnitude of harm or discomfort anticipated in the research are not greater than those ordinarily encountered in daily life or during the performance of routine physical or psychological tests. So something like a survey or focus group would definitely be minimal risk and meet this definition. And then anything that goes beyond that, that's maybe you can't consider it encountered in daily life, that's considered greater than minimal risk, okay? So the IRB decides for each study, is it minimal risk or is it greater than minimal risk? Neither is wrong or right. It's just based on this risk category, it kind of determines what regulations apply to the study. And then when you have the risk idea, this idea of the risk-benefit ratio is examined. This is more specific to each study. So you really want the ratio in line, right? You might have a study that is very low risk. Again, surveys, focus groups, typically you're pretty low risk if you're talking about things that aren't particularly sensitive. And, the benefit of the study might not be very great. We might learn something that's not revolutionary. You might learn something that maybe maybe it doesn't really benefit people a whole lot, but as long as the risk is low and that ratio's in line, that can be approvable. Then you might have something like a completely new drug that no one knows whether it's safe or not, right? And the risk there for someone might be quite high. But the benefit of having that drug become a treatment or something like that might also be really high. So it's about getting the ratio correct, and the IRB considers this with each application. I mentioned briefly that there are additional protections for vulnerable populations. When you think about those unethical examples we brought up at the start and the historical foundation, I think a common thread there is almost everyone in those populations were maybe vulnerable to some coercion or undue influence into a study, right? And so the IRB considers that. Now, the regulations identify specific vulnerable populations that require additional protections, and that would be children, neonates. I think that's obvious why. Fetuses, obviously. Prisoners themselves. It's not that we don't want to do research with prisoners. It's just that they're in a very vulnerable position and protections need to be in place. And then some protections need to be in place with people that maybe can't make a decision for themselves, right? And then some socioeconomically disadvantaged populations might also be vulnerable to coercion and undue influence. So I want to reiterate that it doesn't mean they shouldn't be in research, right? Because those bearing the burden should bear the benefit. We need to understand certain things about prisoners to be able to do better by them, right? Same with children, neonates, fetuses. So it's not that they shouldn't be in research, it's that they should be protected in ways to make sure that there's no coercion or undue influence to be in research. I'll add one more thing to that. These are the federally recognized vulnerable populations, but it doesn't mean that there aren't any outside of this. And the example I usually give is at the University of Utah. If you're doing research on student athletes, we consider that kind of a vulnerable population because they're in a position where they might be getting a scholarship, something like that, and they might feel some coercion or undue influence to be in research by the institution that they are, an athlete for. So that's one that would be specific to the University of Utah, right? So this is a list of federally recognized vulnerable populations, but there can be other populations that might be more vulnerable to coercion or undue influence, and we consider those as well. Okay, this slide shows you the levels of IRB review. Again, don't need to memorize anything here because the IRB does this all for you. You don't need to make these decisions yourself, but just so you know, the top of this refers to the risk level that we talked about. So either it doesn't meet the definition of a human subject or research. That's what this would be, a non-human subject research project. Or the study's minimal risk. And then, as I said, anything else is greater than minimal risk. And the IRB review path is determined by that risk level. So if it's not human subject research, you don't need IRB approval, right? So we get these sometimes. So we get applications where they submit them to us and we're like, you know what, that doesn't meet the definition of research, or that doesn't meet the definition of a human subject. And we just say, hey, you don't need IRB review. Then there's this idea, if it's minimal risk, there's exemption review, expedited review, and convened board review, right? So these are terms pulled from the regulations. They're not very intuitive terms, but it basically means an exemption review just means it goes through a quicker review process. It doesn't go to a full board of scientists and community members. It's minimal risk. It meets some criteria that the federal regulations outline, and you get approval a little bit quicker and without a full review. Expedited review, even though it sounds like it's faster, it doesn't mean that. It actually just means one board member reviews it rather than a full convened board committee. And then some minimal risk studies go to a convened board. And then anything that's considered greater than a minimal risk goes to that full board of scientists, community members, and such. So you submit an IRB application, you'll get a minimal risk determination, and you'll get a letter that says your study qualified for exemption review, expedited review, or convened board. And this is that review process. Okay, that's all the behind scenes stuff of the IRB and what we do. Now I'm getting a little more practical with these slides on kind of for you to start thinking about what it's like to design your own research studies and how to prepare for kind of an IRB review process when you do end up needing one, okay? So one of the things that seemed helpful for students is to start thinking about the recruitment and consent process, okay? So when I was a student and needed to do a research study, I was kind of, I didn't really know how to navigate the consent process. So just to give you an idea, common recruitment methods for studies that involve human subjects. One of the main ones is just in-person recruitment, right? I mean, you walk up to someone and ask if they want to be in your study. Don't see that as common now with the digital era, but obviously that's a thing. Examples of doing like a survey at a farmer's market or something like that. Then we see a lot of studies that send recruitment letters. So if you have a population where you know, let's say you have information on how to get to email addresses or actual physical letters, recruitment letters can be sent out to potential participants that talk about your study and invite them to join your study. Advertising is a method. Obviously, a lot of times if you have funding, you can do advertising, but a lot of students and stuff will advertise on social media channels, or, you know, I'm sure you've seen a lot of flyers posted up around campus that say, hey, do you want to be in my research study, and give you like contact information. We see that quite a bit. And then there's telephone calls. The University of Utah does not allow cold calling, which means for medical campus research, we don't let you call people out of the blue because they have some sort of disease or something, because it's not protecting their privacy. But telephone calls in a different setting are totally fine, right? So if it's a public number, something like that, you can certainly call people to invite them to be in your study. So these are pretty common recruitment methods when you're trying to recruit potential participants to your studies. And then when it's time to try to enroll them in your study, there's an informed consent process, right? So informed consent is a process. I want to label that. It's not just a document. It's a process where we're talking to the potential participant about the study, describing the risks, benefits, what it's about, everything like that. And then there's the idea of the documentation along with it. And that's where you actually have a physical document. It might get signed, might not get signed. There's this idea of waivers. So it's an IRB term, and we'll talk about consent and what waivers are. I won't go into a lot here, but basically if there's some elements of consent that are normally required, but your study doesn't make sense for, you can apply for waivers through the IRB. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then the regulations actually outline the required elements of consent. So when you start writing a consent document for your study, it's not like you're left all alone. There's actually required elements, and I'll show you the resources you have for writing a consent document or a consent process. And then always, depending on the population that you're studying, you might have special considerations, like maybe you need a translator because it's a non-English speaking population. Perhaps it's a kind of a difficult study or sensitive study, or maybe it's a lot of risk involved, and participants need extra time to talk to their family and friends. You know, we see this and see a lot of cancer research at the University of Utah, and a lot of times in order to be in a treatment study, they really need some time to talk it over with their family. It's a tough decision. Let's see. Now, the next slide talks about getting consent. So you can get consent in 3 ways, okay? The gold standard is when you're inviting someone to be in your study, you want to have a process where you're talking to the person, and then you also want a signed document, okay? That's the gold standard. But then in some cases, you can apply for a waiver of that documenting of the consent, okay? So this would be, I see this a lot with surveys where it's like, hey, we're going to explain the study to them at the start of the survey, but we're not going to talk to them or get a written signature. We're just going to say, hey, here's the study. By you completing the survey, you are giving consent to be in the study. That would be an example of one where you're informing them about the study, but you're not necessarily getting a signed document back. And we see that a lot with minimal risk studies, focus groups, interviews, surveys, things like that. And then in some cases, a waiver of consent altogether is appropriate, right? So obviously, if you can get consent and inform people, that is the gold standard. But there are some situations where maybe getting consent is not even possible. And that's when you would apply for a waiver of the full consent process. The most common example here is secondary data analysis studies. You might want to analyze private information, or private identifiable information about people, but you don't have a way to actually meaningfully get consent from them. All right. So the IRB would approve a waiver of consent in some of those cases and just make sure there's really good privacy and confidentiality practices on that data. So three ways to get consent. The most common one for students in behavioral research is this idea of having a consent cover letter where you're not getting a signature and it's just before your interview, focus group, survey, or something like that. And so I just threw up here an example of it to show you, although it's a little wordy, you can really just fit all required elements of consent in one page, okay? And I'll show you, we have a lot of guidance for you in this realm, but so it might seem like a lot when you start this process, but there's a lot of guidance and a lot of help for you, and it doesn't need to be egregious for studies that aren't really complex, which is most the case for students. Okay, so in order to get a waiver of that consent, I mentioned this is very common with existing database studies. The study has to be minimal risk in order to waive the idea of consent. You've got to justify to the IRB why it's not practicable to get consent from participants. And then you have to explain how you're going to protect the rights and welfare of participants' data if you're not getting consent, right? And then a big one is, are you giving your results back to participants? And usually the answer is no, because you can't get consent. You probably can't give the results back, okay? So these are the criteria we ask researchers to tell the IRB before we grant a waiver of consent. This is just to show you the guidance that we have, okay? At the University of Utah IRB, and even if you're not affiliated with the University of Utah, you can still use our website guidance for your research. We've separated the informed consent guidance into process and the document, right? So the process is how you're talking to people. How's that going to work? And we've pulled them all into subsections of, here's a process checklist. So when you're deciding how to do your consent process, we literally have a checklist for you that says you cover all these elements. And then we have models, different ways that other studies do consent processes that you can mimic for your own study. And then we have the same thing for consent documents, okay? So we have a checklist that tells you all the elements that you need to have in your consent document. And then we have models, consent documents that are used for different types of research. And you can really utilize these to your benefit. Consent document models, you can literally take and copy and paste and then just kind of adjust the wording for your specific study. So it's really helpful to help navigate all these requirements for consent that can sometimes be overbearing for new researchers. I think this is an animated slide here just to show our website. That's changed a little bit, but you can see it's kind of, we got consent process checklists. And as you click on them, it'll tell you not only give you discussion points, but also the regulatory references to each of the required checklists, right? And then we even have really easy printable PDFs if you don't want to have to navigate all this kind of wordy website stuff. So that's how it breaks down. That's our consent guidance online. So use that to your benefit when you start your research careers. I just add this one element. Sometimes you are wanting to enroll a population that maybe you don't fully speak fluently, right? So we still want to enroll people that don't speak English in studies. And we have what's considered a short form. So we have translated short forms that you can use. We call them short forms because it basically translates to a language so they can follow along the consent process, even if the main consent form is in English and you're just speaking to them in their native language. So just another resource available to you if you're enrolling a population that speaks a different language. Okay, with that in mind, I'll just this last section is to show you the IRB resources that you have available to you, okay? Because there's a lot of information. I know some of you might be doing active research projects now, but most likely you're going to interact with IRB in the future. So I want you to know the resources you have when you get to that point, right? So now hopefully you have a general idea. Why do we have IRBs? Hopefully you have a general idea. What does the university IRB look like? What do they do? And now here are the resources for you as researchers, students. We have an online application system called ERICA. We call her ERICA, that stands for Electronic Research Integrity Compliance Administration System. That's why we have a short name for it. And I've been interacting with IRBs across the nation in my job, and I've realized that this is actually a really, really, really good application system for navigating the IRB review process. So you want to use it to your benefit, okay? So ERICA is an online system. You log in using your University of Utah credentials like you would any other University of Utah, like CIS login. It's a smart form. So the idea is that we do so much different type of research at the University of Utah IRB. As you answer questions throughout it, it should hopefully just generate questions that are applicable to your study as you go through it. Sometimes because it's a smart form, if it doesn't seem applicable to your study, it might be because you selected something earlier that wasn't correct. But the main thing I would say about this is there's a ton of help text in this system. So as you're going through the process of filling out a research application through the ERICA system, it'll send you so many links to guidance, help text within each question, so you have a general idea of what the IRB is looking for. All correspondence goes through your email that's associated with your University of Utah login. So it's a great system. You can go in and mess around and never submit anything to the IRB, right? So I always reiterate that with students. Sometimes when you're feeling nervous about maybe having to go through the IRB review process, you just want to dig in there and look at it, pull up some help text. You can do that. You can save it, come back later. You can work in there as long as you want, and you never have to submit it to the IRB, right? So it's a system that you can use to help navigate. This is what it looks like. This is our website, Institutional Review Board. If you go at the top, there's this ERICA Online button here, and you log in using your University of Utah credentials. Let's see, and then this is kind of the front page of it. It's just an online web application, okay? So nothing crazy there, but you go to this. How do you start an application? You go to your IRB tab, and there's a button that says create a new study application. So you can do that as a University of Utah student at any time and don't have to submit it, just to figure out what we're looking for, okay? Okay, and this is a reminder. This is, again, kind of like that earlier slide showing that the IRB review is just one element of a larger human research protection program. This ERICA system is awesome because based on how you answer the application, it will route you through everything that's required, okay? So everybody goes through a conflict of interest review. Students, you almost never have a conflict of interest because you don't have any funding for your research, right? But it still goes through that review. Most student research doesn't require all this other review, but just so you know, it's all centralized. All you have to do is fill out one application, and then it will, once you submit it, it'll go through any necessary human research protection reviews. The slide's a little busy, but if you look at the red boxes, this is what we ask on. These are the sections of an IRB application that every study answers, right? So study introduction, locations, sponsors, participants. We ask you to tell us who you're enrolling. Study information is more like how you get in consent. Do you need waivers that we talked about? We ask you to tell us the risks and benefits of your study, how you're monitoring data. And then there's an area to attach documents and consent documents and things like that. And then because of the smart logic, as you answer questions within these kind of sections, it'll kind of elaborate from that point on. Okay, last few slides here. Here's a slide that kind of shows you the IRB review process, okay? So go in there, navigate the application system. Once it's ready, you hit the submit button. This slide says PI. That stands for Principal Investigator. We use that term a lot at IRB. Anybody can be a principal investigator. A student could be a principal investigator. Faculty can be a principal investigator. A physician, you know what I mean? So it doesn't, you don't have to have certain credentials to be a PI, right? It just means you're the one running the research project. So if you're a student, you're the PI for a research project, you submit the application. It goes to a pre-review state, okay? So we have IRB staff. I manage a team that does pre-reviews your application. The whole point here is to get the application to a point where it can be approved, okay? So the IRB doesn't review applications and say, no, you're unethical, anything like that, okay? So all we're doing is getting it to a point where it's ready to be approved, okay? So we have staff for that. So if you're feeling nervous about your application or anything and feel like you don't quite understand, don't worry about it. Hit that submit button. We have staff dedicated to get that application up to speed, okay? And all we do is we do a pre-review and we send you revisions through the Erica system, and they go to your email. They say, hey, here's a couple areas of the application you need to fix up. Say you missed an element in your consent document, we'll tell you to add it back, okay? So there's an IRB pre-review process, and we can go back and forth during pre-review for as long as it takes to get your application to go forward, okay? So don't hesitate to hit that submit button. It doesn't need to be perfect. We'll help you get it perfect. Then the IRB staff gives it a preliminary risk assessment. Excuse me. Is it minimal risk or is it greater than minimal risk? And we do that because that determines what kind of review process happens to it, as I illustrated in a previous slide. So most of your studies will likely go through a pre-review process where it goes back and forth a few times. Then we'll probably call it minimal risk if you're doing some sort of behavioral research. And then it'll go to an exempt review or expedited review or the full convene board after that. And once approved, you'll get a letter that says your study's approved and you're ready to move forward. So that's the IRB review process. Here's some timelines. Timelines are really, really hard. It's one of the questions I get a whole lot. How long is it going to take me to get IRB approval? A lot of students, right? You're like, you got to get your data collected and you got to write a paper for your class. So you got time restraints, okay? The IRB review process can take some time. I'll just focus on this new study application. Really, we try to get to the pre-review 2 weeks after you hit that submit button, okay? And then it can go back and forth in pre-review until it's ready, right? So that's why it's hard to estimate how long it'll take. But we try to get a response back to you within 2 weeks. And then it takes anywhere between 2 and 4 weeks after the application's ready to get full approval. I will say, I think the majority of student projects qualify for exemption review. So typically it takes, you know, the faster end of that 2 to 4 weeks to get that initial approval. So I would just say this slide will just tell you start as soon as you can when you have a project that needs IRB approval. Send us an email. We're people if you're under time constraints, and we'll try to prioritize your review. But in general, it might take a full month and maybe a teeny bit longer to get your IRB approval. Okay, so submit as soon as you can. This mentions continuing reviews and amendments. These are studies that are more risky that need to come back every year and report the progress to the IRB. A continuing review is what that's called. And then there are amendments, right? So you might get approval for your study, and then you change something in the study drastically, right? So it's not like it happens all the time. You have an idea of how you're going to run your study and you're like, you know, I'm going to change it. I'm going to do it this way, a little different. You submit an amendment. You don't have to submit a whole new study application. And those amendments take a little bit of time to review as well. So that's what this slide's kind of pointing at. Okay, that's everything. I mentioned the Erica system. This is probably your best resource as to navigate what the IRB is going to ask of you. We have our website that has so much stuff on it. It can be overwhelming because there's so much resource. And that's why sometimes I'm like, hey, get into the Erica system. get to the point where the IRB is asking you something you don't know how to answer, and then it'll it'll link you to the appropriate guidance on our website. So if you go straight to the website, it might be a little overwhelming, although there is a lot of helpful information on there. We have something called an investigator guidance series that breaks down every little topic into more detail in PDFs that you can read about. And then, of course, all that consent kind of help that I illustrated. So a lot of stuff there. Lastly, we have, there's a research education department that literally has classes to talk about IRBs and navigating IRBs and various other topics that aren't IRB related. Okay, so they have online and live classes offered through education, research education. So you can sign up for those at any time as a student for free. And then there are live classes as well. So tons of resources for you guys as students. And as your students and as you're affiliated with the University of Utah, I just recommend you using them as much as possible because it's really great for your research careers. You can contact us. The IRB sometimes I think is labeled a little bit as a bureaucratic kind of application process, because it kind of is. But at the same time, we're here to get your research approved, and we're people. Okay, so you can reach out to me at any point via email. A lot of students have questions, and I'm happy to answer them at any point. We also have a general IRB contact that you can reach at any point. Yeah, let me know if you have any questions. If not, Shelley, you can take over. Thank you, guys.
Gary, we did have that one question from a registrant. What are the differences in doing an IRB for an on-campus study versus one that is on campus and also on local high schools?
Oh, right. Thank you. Thank you for reminding me. That's a good question. So kind of goes back to what that slide I had that talked about your IRB is the institution you're affiliated with as the researcher. So as a student researcher, if you're doing a research study on campus, you go through the University of Utah IRB and get approval. If you're doing research in a high school, you still get University of Utah IRB approval. There's not a difference in the IRB review process. Now, when it comes to research in schools, like high schools, you obviously need to get some approvals from the school district to be able to go in there and do research. So there are some requirements like that the IRB might tell you, hey, make sure you get approval from the principal or something like that. But as far as the IRB process for research that occurs on campus or somewhere like a high school, same process, okay? So think of it less about where you're recruiting participants, but more about who's doing the research. If you're a University of Utah person doing the research, it doesn't matter where you're recruiting, other than if it's somewhere that requires additional like approvals and stuff, the IRB might tell you to make sure you have those in line, okay? So high schools, we see a lot of research like that. And then other good examples are sometimes, you know, if you're just going into the community to recruit and there's not really any additional things to consider, you know, we see some studies that want to go to like Native American tribes, right? Stuff like that. And there's some additional approvals outside of the IRB that we expect you to get. But in general, the IRB process for those types of studies are the same.
Just want to remind everybody about the event evaluation. Here's the QR code, and I'm putting the link in the chat again. Reminder, the SPUR and the UROP scholars must fill this out in order to receive credit for attending the event today. And we just want to remind you that the Office of Undergraduate Research, we're in the SEAL Center. We're here Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. Our website is our.utah.edu, and you can email us at our@utah.edu. And thank you again, Gary.
Yeah, thank you guys. Great. Yeah, feel free to reach out to me in the future as you have questions.